Bolívar, the Bankster's Liberator. A forbidden history of Simón Bolívar and the invention of modern servitude. MXTM, aka Vitsu. October 23, 2025. 1. 2. Share. The Banker's Liberator by Pirate First. 3.5, 4 megabytes bullet operator PDF file download. Forward. History, they say, is written by victors, but in the New World, it was audited by their bankers. This book is a reconstruction from the margins, a speculative dossier stitched from letters, ledgers, and whispers between London drawing rooms and the dusty barracks of Caracas. It begins not with the Liberator astride a horse, but with a failed dandy in Paris, mocked, penniless, and desperate to matter. The humiliation of Simón Bolívar was not a footnote, it was the ignition. He swore to destroy the empires that sneered at him, yet every step toward revolution led him deeper into their web. Behind his battles moved a quieter army, British financiers, Irish aides, and mercenaries of the pen. They promised liberty but kept the receipts. When Bolívar abolished slavery, they congratulated him, then handed him a new vocabulary of control, debt, interest, modernization. This is not the Bolívar of marble plazas or streaming screens. It is the Bolívar of ledgers and shadows, a man liberated from one empire only to midwife another. Call it fiction if you need to sleep at night. Pirate First. Table of Contents. Part 1. The Parisian Wound. 1. Le Petit Creole, Bolívar among the salons of Napoleonic Paris, mocked as a colonial ornament. 2. The debts of pleasure, libertinage, gambling, and the slow liquidation of a fortune. 3. A promise on Monte Sacro, the vow to free America, half prophecy, half hangover. Part 2. The Making of a Patsy. 4. Return of the Disinherited, the young aristocrat back in Caracas, selling fire to fellow landlords. 5. The Secret Correspondent, letters intercepted between Bolívar and a mysterious English patron. 6. The Handler, arrival of Daniel Florence O'Leary, the Irish liaison with orders from the City of London. Part 3. The Banker's War. 7. The British Legion, mercenaries in red coats reborn as liberators. 8. Bearings and bayonets, how the Bank of England financed revolution at compound interest. 9. The Mask of Liberty, decrees of abolition paired with contracts of eternal debt. Part 4. The Vanishing Body. 10. The Voyage That Never Was, Bolívar's last, aborted escape to Cuba. 11. The Substitute, a forged death, a traded corpse, a managed myth. 12. O'Leary's Gospel, the aide who rewrote history to serve the markets. Part 5. The New Chains. 13. The Republic as Plantation, post-independence economies rebuilt on credit and wage bondage. 14. The Banker's Ghost, London celebrates a free America whose currencies it now owns. 15. The Bones and the Broadcast, 2 centuries later, the exhumed skeleton and its televised resurrection. Epilogue, the Freedom Account. From shackles to signatures, from empire to market, the Liberator becomes the first modern debtor, and the continent his collateral. Next in the first chapter, Le Petit Creole, set in Napoleonic Paris, painting the moment of humiliation that sets his descent into history's trap. Part 1. The Parisian Wound, Bolívar among the salons of Napoleonic Paris, mocked as a colonial ornament. The Parisian Wound is written as historical fiction, vivid, document-tinged, but plausible. Part 1. The Parisian Wound. 1. Le Petit Creole. Paris, 1804. The city smelled of starch and smoke, of lilac and empire. Every café murmured Napoleon's name as though it were incense, and the Seine carried reflections of new monuments built on old bones. Into this world wandered a slim Venezuelan with volcanic eyes and a wardrobe that tried too hard. Simón Bolívar, 21, newly widowed, recently disinherited, came armed with letters of introduction and the naive conviction that Paris would welcome genius wherever it bloomed. They called him Le Petit Creole behind their painted fans, an ornament from the tropics, A curiosity who quoted Rousseau with a Spanish accent and didn't know when to laugh at the right jokes. The duchesses liked his melancholy, the bankers liked his inheritance, the philosophers ignored him. He spent his evenings drifting between salons, Madame de Staël's glittering autopsy of the revolution, Talleyrand's perfumed treachery, the smoky gambling dens where titles were wagered like horses. Everywhere he went, he was tolerated, never trusted. The colonies, one hostess whispered, breed enthusiasm the way the tropics breed fever. By spring his purse was empty. He had pawned cufflinks, borrowed from distant cousins, and sold the last of his wife's jewelry to pay for powdered wigs and opera tickets. Pleasure was the only currency that still believed in him. The nights became longer, the laughter sharper. Once, drunk on absinthe and humiliation, he challenged a baron's son to a duel for calling him a brown Bonaparte. The duel never happened. The baron's friends paid him to disappear for a week. He returned thinner, quieter, and newly fluent in contempt. That summer, at the Tuileries, he caught a glimpse of Napoleon himself, a small, blazing man surrounded by generals. Bolívar saw in him both the ridicule and the redemption of his own kind, a provincial made emperor through sheer insolence. Something in that vision rewired him. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Europe will never love us, only fear us. To be free, America must become its own tyrant." The phrase would never reach print. It was too honest. But it marked the end of the boy who had come to be admired and the birth of the man who would rather be obeyed. Paris taught him 3 lessons. Money is the mother tongue of civilization. Liberty without a banker is a dream unpaid. Every revolution begins as revenge for a humiliation. When he left for Italy the next year, he carried little more than debts, a fever, and the seed of vengeance disguised as patriotism. The salons forgot him. History would not. Chapter 2. The Debts of Pleasure. Following him through the libertine collapse that completes his metamorphosis from playboy to proto-revolutionary. 2. The Debts of Pleasure. Libertinage, gambling, and the slow liquidation of a fortune. The debts of pleasure. The season of rain fell gently over Paris, turning the cobblestones slick and the gaslights into trembling halos. Simón Bolívar had learned by then that every pleasure in Europe came with an invoice. He kept a small apartment on the Rue Saint-Honoré, 2 floors above a modiste who claimed to have dressed Josephine. His neighbors were musicians, courtesans, and gamblers, each fluent in a different dialect of survival. The landlord accepted promises as rent, the wine merchant did not. Most nights, he haunted the gambling rooms near the Palais Royal. The cards were an orchestra of temptation, the shuffle, the snap, the sigh of another week's allowance dissolving into a banker's smile. He lost with elegance, which in Paris counted for more than winning. A reputation was a currency of its own. By winter, his inheritance had dwindled to rumors. Creditors stalked him with polite persistence. A perfumed letter from Caracas begged him to return before his estates were swallowed by cousins with better lawyers. He ignored it. Pride, not revolution, kept him in Paris. Pride, and a dancer named Lucien du Nord, whose laughter could bankrupt men faster than any war. Lucienne called him Mon Petit Vulcan. She liked the way he spoke of freedom as if it were a woman he intended to seduce. He paid her debts until he became one of them. When he finally couldn't, she disappeared into another patron's carriage. The loss hurt less than the insult. He had mistaken indulgence for belonging. One evening, as snow fell like ash, he dined at a banker's house where half the guests were speculators in the slave trade and the other half philosophers of human rights. The host toasted commerce and civilization. Bolívar laughed a second too late. Someone remarked that liberty was a luxury for those who could afford it. He raised his glass and replied, quietly, "Then I shall buy it with my ruin." A few weeks later, he sold the last of his jewels and left Paris for Italy. On the road south, he wrote in his notebook, "Pleasure was a loan. Freedom will be the repayment." He imagined the revolution as a debtor's revolt against the entire world ledger, against the Europe that had measured his worth in coin and contempt. But already, unseen, the bankers who would fund his wars were sharpening their quills. He would return to the New World not as a son, but as a client. The ship that bore him across the Atlantic creaked like an exhausted conscience. In the hold, trunks of fine linen and books of Voltaire, jostled beside crates of French muskets bought on credit. Bolivar stood on the deck at dusk, feeling the sea wind like an auditor's breath. Paris had taken his innocence and his fortune, but left him with a more durable inheritance, a hunger to matter, and a debt he would never finish paying. When Caracas rose against the Spanish crown a few years later, he was ready, too ready. He financed skirmishes with borrowed funds, wrote proclamations on borrowed ideals, and recruited men with promises the treasury could not meet. Each victory deepened the ledger. In dreams, he still saw Lucienne's face, framed by the candlelight of a Paris room. Mon Petit Volcan, she had called him, Little Volcano. The bankers would later call him the Liberator. Both names fit. Both burned. He had mistaken pleasure for freedom. Now he mistook war for redemption. The colonies would take decades to realize that his revolution had been mortgaged before the first shot was fired. The rain that once glossed the Paris stones would fall again on tropical soil, this time washing blood instead of perfume. And somewhere, in the vaults of London, the balanced sheets of the new world began to glow faintly, like embers waiting for breath. Chapter 3. A Promise on Monte Sacro, where he swears his oath to liberate the Americas, an oath already underwritten by invisible creditors. Part 2. The Making of a Patsy. 3. A Promise on Monte Sacro, the vow to free America, half prophecy, half hangover. The road to Rome was an autopsy of empires. Bolívar, dusty and half-starved, walked through the ruins like a ghost auditioning for history. Columns rose like broken teeth from the soil. The air smelled of laurel and rot. He thought of Paris, the mirrors, the laughter, the bills unpaid, and realized that civilization was only decadence with a better tailor. In Tivoli, he met a fellow exile, the Venezuelan tutor Simón Rodriguez, whose madness was indistinguishable from genius. Rodriguez lived on coffee, manuscripts, and rage against monarchies. His pupils had either fled or starved. Education, he said, is the true revolution. Arm a people with knowledge, and the kings will hang themselves out of boredom. They shared a bottle of cheap wine beneath the cypresses of Monte Sacro. Rome sprawled below them, lit like a dying constellation. Bolívar felt the hangover of civilization pressing on his skull. The empire had died, yet its creditors still collected. "Look," Rodriguez said, pointing toward the city. "All this marble, all this glory, built by slaves. And still, men kneel." Bolívar stared at the horizon. His voice came out low, almost embarrassed by its own conviction. "I swear before you, I will not rest until my country is free, until America is sovereign." Rodriguez laughed softly, perhaps from faith, perhaps from pity. "Free? My boy, the world is a ledger. Every freedom must be paid for." But Bolívar was no longer listening. The vow burned through him like a fever. He saw himself leading armies across the Andes, breaking chains, redeeming continents. He mistook the tremor of intoxication for revelation. At dawn, he descended the mountain with the solemnity of a prophet and the thirst of a debtor. The vow was his new currency, one that would purchase him glory, ruin, and a future mortgage to invisible bankers. Because even then, as he dreamed of liberation, letters were being drafted in London. Financiers were calculating the cost of his idealism. Freedom would come, just not unpaid. And somewhere in his chest, beneath the hangover and the hunger, he already sensed it. That his revolution would be financed like any other commodity. That his promise on Monte Sacro had been overheard by the gods of credit. They smiled and began the paperwork. Part 2. The Making of a Patsy. 4. Return of the Disinherited. The young aristocrat back in Caracas, selling fire to fellow landlords. 4. Return of the Disinherited. The young aristocrat back in Caracas, selling fire to fellow landlords. When Bolívar returned to Caracas, the sea looked indifferent, as if it had seen too many prodigals come home with new philosophies and empty pockets. The ship's deck creaked like a conscience. In his trunk lay two things of value: a European wardrobe already out of fashion, and a notebook full of promises he didn't yet know how to keep. The city received him with the polite suspicion reserved for failed heirs. His family name still opened doors, but now it led mostly to drawing rooms where planters and merchants whispered about revolts in Haiti and whether such contagions might drift across the Caribbean. They called liberty a fine idea, in the same tone one might use for opera or architecture, something beautiful, provided it remained elsewhere. Bolivar moved among them like a ghost of their future, a young man in borrowed linen, aflame with European rhetoric. He spoke of Rousseau and Rome, of sacred rights and the tyranny of kings. The old men nodded, poured more wine, and changed the subject to sugar yields and tariffs. He began to understand that revolution in Caracas would require a salesman's tongue. So he became one. He repackaged emancipation as prestige, rebellion as inheritance. Gentlemen, he told them, the Americans have proven it. Liberty is the new nobility. The phrase stuck. For the first time, they listened. He hosted salons by candlelight, the wax melting like spent patience. Poets and priests came, planters and soldiers, all drawn to the heat of a young man who seemed both possessed and patronless. Bolivar quoted the philosophers he once mocked in Paris, now with missionary fervor. His words tasted of wine and prophecy. Behind the rhetoric, though, he saw the trap closing. Every ally was a creditor, every favor a lien. The wealthy Creoles who cheered his speeches did not dream of equality. They dreamed of replacing one crown with another, theirs. Bolivar's revolution was already being mortgaged to their ambitions. Late one night, walking home under the oil lamps, he stopped before the family estate, its gates locked, its servants unpaid. The moonlight caught on the rusting bars, and he smiled bitterly. "They will follow me," he whispered, "until the bill comes due." Somewhere across the Atlantic, that bill was already being drafted. In the counting rooms of London, men in waistcoats murmured the name Bolivar with interest, literal interest. The revolution, like any venture, needed capital. And capital always requires collateral. 5. The secret correspondent letters intercepted between Bolivar and a mysterious English patron. It began with a letter sealed in blue wax, the color of discretion. Delivered aboard a merchant ship from Kingston, the envelope bore no name. Only a watermark, faint and intricate, like a serpent eating its tail. Bolivar read it 3 times by candlelight, uncertain whether he had been chosen or trapped. "Senor B, we take a sincere interest in your noble enterprise. The Crown of Spain is an old debtor, and every debtor must someday yield its assets. Should you seek means to accelerate this inevitable adjustment, we stand ready to assist. Your friend in Threadneedle Street." Threadneedle Street, the heart of London's banking district. The letter smelled faintly of iron gall ink and colonial ambition. Bolivar burned it, then rewrote it from memory into his journal, where it became a prayer rather than a confession. Over the months that followed, more letters arrived, unsigned, but unmistakably from the same hand. They spoke of credit in spirit and in specie, of agents sympathetic to the cause, of merchants in Curaçao who could arrange introductions under neutral flags. Each note was phrased as friendship, yet structured as a contract. He began replying, at first cautiously, later compulsively. He described the political winds in Venezuela, the weakness of royal garrisons, the timidity of his peers. He assured his friend that freedom was inevitable, that only a small investment could hasten destiny. In return came crates of uniforms, muskets, printing presses, each marked with symbols no customs officer could trace. The revolution gained a pulse, but so did his paranoia. One night, in a tavern near La Guaira, a courier slipped while drunk and confessed to carrying duplicates of Bolivar's own letters. Copies meant not for London, but for Madrid. Someone was playing both sides of the chessboard. Bolivar spent that night awake, reading and rereading the replies he'd received. The penmanship shifted subtly between letters. The phrasing grew more British, less human. One began with, "Your liberation aligns with our liquidity." It was then he understood that revolutions were simply wars with ledgers. His English patron was not a man but a syndicate, merchants, bankers, and spies, trading in ideals like futures. Bolivar was both asset and instrument, a variable in a calculation older than any flag. He wrote one final reply, short and unsent. Freedom should never arrive on foreign stationery. Then he hid the correspondence inside a false wall in his study, behind a portrait of Lucien du Nord, the dancer who had once cost him everything. When royal soldiers later ransacked the house, they found the painting, but not the letters. Their contents, however, were already known to those who mattered. And in London, behind the polished doors of the Bank of England, a clerk entered a new entry in the private ledgers. Client Bolívar, line of credit, infinite, repayable in blood. 6. The handler arrival of Daniel Florence O'Leary, the Irish liaison with orders from the City of London. The Caribbean sun struck La Guaira like an accusation. Ships from every empire creaked in the harbor, carrying sugar, slaves, and the soft weight of rumor. When the Irishman stepped off the deck of the Mercury Star, he carried none of those. Just a letter of introduction embossed with a lion and a crown, and a satchel heavy enough to command respect. Daniel Florence O'Leary was 30, freckled, and impeccably unremarkable. The sort of man who could disappear in a crowd or reappear beside a general without explanation. To most, he presented himself as a veteran of Wellington's campaigns, now seeking fortune in the Americas. But his papers bore the watermark of the Bank of England, visible only when held to the light. He found Bolívar in a borrowed villa on the outskirts of Caracas, dictating manifestos to a half-drunk secretary. The Liberator looked like a man who'd been arguing with history itself. His boots were muddy, his hair defiant, his uniform half-buttoned. "General Bolívar," O'Leary said, bowing slightly. "London sends its compliments." Bolívar's eyes narrowed. "London? I did not request its friendship." "No," O'Leary smiled, "but you've already accepted its credit." The silence that followed was not hostile, merely mathematical. They dined together that night on salted beef and borrowed wine. The Irishman spoke in the courteous riddles of diplomacy. He mentioned trade routes, consular protection, the necessity of foreign recognition. Then, more softly, the prospect of private financing for public virtue. Bolívar poured another glass. "You mean weapons?" "I mean liquidity," O'Leary replied. "Liberty is a fine word, General, but it must be minted before it can circulate." By the end of the meal, Bolívar had not agreed to anything, but he also had not refused. The next morning, a courier delivered crates marked as scientific instruments. Inside were muskets, maps, and sealed letters bearing the red wax of Threadneedle Street. From that moment on, the revolution acquired a strange efficiency. Armies appeared where there had been none. Dispatches arrived before the riders left. Victories followed invisible calculations. O'Leary became indispensable. He translated English reports, arranged the shipment of powder through neutral merchants, and drafted communiques in a style of English flattery that made Bolívar uneasy. And yet, something in the Irishman's restraint appealed to him. O'Leary never claimed to believe in the cause. He only believed in execution. "Faith," he once said, "is the currency of fools. But discipline, that can buy empires." Bolívar began to rely on him more than his own generals. O'Leary advised moderation when others screamed for vengeance, patience when Bolívar's blood demanded fire. But at night, when the camp quieted, Bolívar would see him by lantern light, writing coded reports in a small black notebook. Those letters went out under diplomatic seal, borne by merchant ships under neutral flags. Some arrived in London, others in Madrid. A few, no one knew where. When pressed, O'Leary would smile and quote scripture. "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's." But his Caesar had a bank account. By the campaign's end, Bolívar's armies marched under banners sewn with British cloth, their gunpowder stamped with British crests. Even the Revolution's printing presses, those sacred machines of liberty, bore tags from Birmingham. The Liberator began to feel like an actor in a play financed by invisible producers. His own proclamations came back to him edited, refined, printed in English before Spanish. O'Leary watched the transformation with polite detachment. In private letters to his superiors, he described Bolívar as a volatile but useful agent of political liquidity. To Bolívar, he remained a friend, his most loyal aide. To London, he was a clerk of history, auditing the balance sheet of empire. And in the ledger of freedom, every victory now came with a footnote. In Chapter 7, The Debt Republic, Independence Under Mortgage, opens with the formal recognition of Bolívar's new government in exchange for loans from London's private syndicates. Part 3, The Bankers' War. 7. The British Legion mercenaries in redcoats reborn as liberators. They landed at Margarita Island under a sun so bright it bleached history itself. 3,000 men, pale and hungover, marching beneath tattered Union Jacks hastily repainted as Republican banners. The locals called them Los Ingleses, though few were truly English. Irish deserters, Scottish drunks, Welsh orphans, and half a dozen Frenchmen who claimed to be anything for the price of rum. Bolívar watched them disembark from the deck of his schooner. To him, they looked less like soldiers than like a fever dream conjured by desperation. Muskets patched with rope, boots mismatched, eyes hollow from too many wars. Yet behind them marched Daniel Florence O'Leary, immaculate as ever, carrying orders written not by Bolívar's hand, but by London's invisible one. They are volunteers, O'Leary explained. Veterans of empire, seeking redemption. Or employment, Bolívar muttered. O'Leary smiled thinly. In our age, the two are identical. The British Legion was the first true export of the Industrial Revolution, war as a service. Financed by merchants from Liverpool and Bristol, their pay disbursed through consuls in Jamaica, their rifles insured by Lloyds of London. Officially, they fought for freedom. Unofficially, they secured trade routes. In the jungles of New Granada, they became legend. Redcoats turned brown with blood and dust, their bugles echoing through valleys that had never known such music. They taught Bolívar's ragged men to fight in formations, to keep records, to obey a clock. The revolution began to move with the rhythm of a factory. O'Leary kept meticulous accounts. For every victory, a shipment of rifles. For every province liberated, a note of debt drawn quietly against its future revenues. Bolívar noticed that his letters of thanks to the Legion's officers were soon followed by consular demands from London, mining concessions, port rights, trade guarantees. In Angostura, as he prepared to address the new Congress, Bolívar stood before a mirror and studied his reflection. The gold on his uniform had been spun in Manchester, his sword forged in Sheffield. Even the ink in his speeches, an English import. When he stepped onto the platform and declared, "We are not Europeans, we are not Indians, we are a mixed species of both," the applause was genuine. But behind the ovation, he could almost hear the quiet scratching of O'Leary's pen, recording each word like an inventory. That night, the Irishman brought him a sealed letter. Bolívar opened it to find a printed invoice. To the Provisional Government of Gran Colombia for services rendered by the British Legion, inclusive of transport, armament, and munitions. Total due, for £1,000,000. He read it twice, then laughed, short and bitter. "They've sent me the bill for my own freedom." O'Leary said nothing. He only folded the paper, returned it to his coat, and murmured, "Freedom, General, was never free. It merely changes lenders." By the time the war reached its height, the British Legion had carved a crimson path across the Andes. Their bones littered the same valleys they'd been paid to liberate. Few lived to collect their wages. Those who did became merchants, landowners, or ghosts in foreign uniforms. Bolívar, watching the horizon from a conquered ridge, felt the old Parisian ache return, the sense of being tolerated, not trusted. The revolution was now efficient, profitable, exportable. The Redcoats had come not to free America, but to repossess it. And somewhere in London, as rain tapped the windows of Threadneedle Street, a banker whispered to his clerk, "The investment matures." Chapter 8 brings the Debt Republic, independence under mortgage, where the newly liberated nations formalize their freedom with contracts that bind them back to the same empire, this time invisibly. 8. Bearings and Bayonets: How the Bank of England Financed Revolution at Compound Interest. London, 1820. The fog was so thick it made the city sound underwater, the gaslights blurring into globes, the carriages gliding like sharks through the murk. Inside the marble heart of Threadneedle Street, the real war rooms of empire were not lined with maps, but with ledgers. Here, revolutions were calculated, collateralized, and quietly refinanced. Nathan Rothschild's clerks whispered in German. Across the street, Barings Bank kept its own watch on the Atlantic. Between them ran an invisible cable of ambition, the knowledge that chaos, properly underwritten, could yield a finer profit than peace. Gran Colombia was the latest experiment. The bankers called it a promising asset in the Americas. Independence had given it the glamour of virgin territory, but the true prize was its future debt, its power to borrow. Bolívar's triumphs made excellent theater for investors. His image appeared in pamphlets circulated through London coffeehouses, the George Washington of South America, a name carefully chosen, tested for market appeal. Barings agreed to float a bond issue, millions in sterling, secured by customs revenues and patriotic fervor. Bolívar's emissaries signed eagerly, thinking themselves statesmen. In truth, they were co-signers. When the first shipment of British muskets arrived in Cartagena, the ink on the loan had barely dried. Interest accrued even before the gunpowder reached port. Every cannon, every uniform, every press release praising liberty, all of it bought at credit rates more fatal than bullets. O'Leary handled the details. His reports to London were exact to the penny. How much silver could be extracted, which provinces could be pledged as guarantee, which officers might be persuaded to sign without reading the fine print. His handwriting never trembled. Meanwhile, Bolívar marched and proclaimed. The people cheered, the printers roared, and the bankers compounded. By the time he declared victory, the Republic of Gran Colombia was already in arrears. At the Treasury, a British advisor proposed a new idea. Why not stabilize the economy by pegging your new currency to sterling? It sounded reasonable, modern, almost patriotic. Bolívar nodded. The trap closed. Each shipment of aid came tied to a new clause. Each clause gave London another finger on the continent's pulse. Even the uniforms of his diplomats came from Seville Row. In Caracas, peasants whispered that liberty felt strangely like taxation. In London, a Baring brother smiled and wrote in his private diary, South America will pay for its freedom twice, once in blood and once in interest. When Bolívar finally visited Europe again, he was hailed as a hero in salons that once mocked him. Women swooned, bankers bowed. But beneath the applause, he could hear the tick of the compound clock, the one he had wound himself. He dined with the Barings, drank their claret, and toasted the friendship of nations. They smiled as equals. Yet when he left the room, a clerk folded away the silverware and tallied the cost of the dinner, billed discreetly to the Republic of Colombia. Freedom, it turned out, had excellent credit. And from that day forward, the world would learn the new arithmetic of empire. Gunpowder plus interest equals civilization. The next chapter, 9, The Spectre of Credit. How the new republics became clients of an invisible crown, to unfold as a noir descent. Bolívar's slow realization that he'd liberated nothing but debt. 9. The Mask of Liberty decrees of abolition paired with contracts of eternal debt. Bogotá, 1821. The city celebrated freedom as if it were a saint returned from exile. Bells rang. Priests blessed muskets. Bolívar, sunburned and hollow-eyed, stood before the newly convened Congress and read aloud the decree of emancipation. The words were luminous, polished by philosophy and guilt. From this day forth, all men born in Colombia shall be free. The hall erupted in applause. Paper confetti rained down, like the ashes of forgotten promises. But outside, the slaves still bent in the fields. And behind the dais, O'Leary's courier waited with a new batch of documents from London. The abolition decree had a twin, a trade agreement drafted in the same calligraphy, stamped with the same wax, and sealed by the same trembling hands. It granted British merchants unrestricted access to ports, mines, and shipping lanes. A gesture of goodwill, O'Leary explained, to ensure the stability of the new republic. You mean, Bolívar said, a mortgage disguised as mercy. General, O'Leary smiled faintly, what is freedom without liquidity? That night, Bolívar signed both documents, one for the galleries, one for the ledgers. The first abolished human bondage. The second ensured financial servitude in perpetuity. The British called it liberalization. The locals called it modernity. The slaves called it the same old song. Within a year, the Republic's treasury had been emptied by reconstruction projects, rail lines that led nowhere, canals that began and ended in investors' pockets, and a national bank whose vaults contained more English parchment than Colombian coin. Every decree of progress carried a hidden clause. Every ideal had an invoice. Free men, a Caracas editor wrote, but mortgaged soil. Bolivar began to hear strange echoes in his own speeches. Liberty, equity, credit, trust. The words blurred until they seemed to describe a single phenomenon: debt given the shape of hope. He rode through liberated provinces where peasants now worked the same land, only for new masters, companies registered in London and Dublin. The plantations flew no Spanish flags, only ledgers. When he protested, O'Leary presented him with a letter from the Foreign Office. Her Majesty's government recognizes the sovereignty of your republic, contingent upon the fulfillment of prior obligations. Default would endanger said recognition. Bolivar read it in silence. Recognition, it seemed, was a luxury item too. He gathered his ministers in the candlelit palace of San Carlos and declared, "We have changed the masters of our chains, not the metal." No one answered. They all owed something. To London, to creditors, to destiny. Later, alone, Bolivar unrolled the first copy of the Emancipation Decree. The ink had faded. The signature, his own, looked alien. Beneath it, on a separate sheet, was the counterpart contract, a 30-year bond, renewable indefinitely, at compound interest. He placed the two documents side by side. One proclaimed men free. The other made their nation a debtor state. The candle guttered. The wax ran. And Bolivar finally understood what the bankers had built: a world where slavery no longer required chains, only signatures. Chapter 10. The Ghost Republic. Bolivar's last march through a continent that had already been repossessed, to serve as the elegiac close of Part 3, The Bankers' War. Part 4, The Vanishing Body. 10. The Voyage That Never Was. Bolivar's last, aborted escape to Cuba. He had planned the voyage in whispers, letters folded into the seams of coats, routes drawn in the invisible ink of exile. But the sea had other loyalties. Cartagena's harbor, humid and half-mutinous, watched as Bolivar's entourage dissolved one by one, men deserting not from fear of Spain, but from fatigue of myth. The general, once adorned in bronze and laurel, now coughed blood into his silk handkerchief. He was to embark for Havana under a false name, papers stamped with the watermark of mercy. Yet the ship never came. Some say it was intercepted. Others, that the British consul delayed it deliberately. His handler, O'Leary, wrote the last entries in an increasingly encrypted journal. The Liberator's departure is postponed by unseen hands. London still pays the pensions, but demands no miracles, only silence. In the Caribbean's heat, Bolivar began to suspect he had never been free, not in Paris, not in Caracas, not even atop the Andes when all the world cheered his name. He was a ledger entry, a pawn in the great balancing act between empire and its illusion of emancipation. At night he dreamt of Monte Sacro again, but the vow had changed. Now the mountain crumbled into coins, and the wind spoke in the clipped accents of bankers. When he died on Colombian soil, the documents of his final voyage were burned. Yet rumors persisted, that a decoy coffin was sent to Santa Marta, that Bolivar lived out his final years in Havana under the watch of a discreet Irishman, whose pay still arrived from Threadneedle Street. And thus ended not a hero's tale, but an investment, liquidated at a loss acceptable to the crown. We continue with Chapter 11, The Exhumation, Who Owns a Dead Liberator, doubling its weight and giving it that post-mortem mystery edge. 11. The Substitute, a forged death, a traded corpse, a managed myth. The official narrative sealed the coffin before anyone dared to question the weight. Santa Marta mourned a man it had never known, and Bogota sent its finest orator to recite verses no one heard. Bolivar's remains, if remains they were, traveled under guard, while the Irishman with the careful handwriting vanished from all ledgers. Years later, a Cuban doctor boasted, after too much rum, of a South American ghost under his care. A thin man with the bearing of command, obsessed with maps and debts, muttering that freedom was a balance sheet. The doctor died in a mysterious fire. The patient's name was never recorded. Meanwhile, the Bank of England closed its books on the Latin American loan program. Profits were acceptable. Nations were nominally independent, but their customs houses pledged to London for generations. Bolivar's corpse, symbol, saint, collateral, was no longer needed. O'Leary, now living quietly in Jamaica under a new name, received one final letter stamped with the sigil of the Foreign Office. The account is settled. Ensure the myth remains intact. From that moment, Bolívar existed more powerfully as an idea than as a man. His bronze statues sprouted like mushrooms after rain, each financed by the same foreign debt he once denounced. A hero manufactured by those who found utility in his legend, amassed to sanctify the economic colonization of the continent. Centuries would pass before anyone dared to exhume him. DNA tests, bone density analyses, mitochondrial traces, all inconclusive. The forensic experts spoke of irregularities, but not of substitution. It was easier, as always, to worship the story. For what is history, if not the most profitable forgery? Part 5. The New Chains. In Part 5, the recolonization of the republics, detailing the Great Default, London's quiet victory over the liberated continent. 12. O'Leary's Gospel, the aide who rewrote history to serve the markets. Daniel Florence O'Leary understood from the beginning that wars were not won with bullets, but with archives. Bolívar had carried a sword, O'Leary carried ink, and in the end, ink ruled the empire more completely than steel ever could. When the Liberator was gone, vanished, dead, or deliberately misplaced, the Irishman inherited his papers. Thousands of pages, proclamations, decrees, drafts of letters never sent, personal confessions scrawled in moments of despair. O'Leary saw in them the foundation of a new scripture, one that could turn creditors into apostles. In Kingston, under the tropical rains, he began his work. The humid air warped the parchment. His mind warped the truth. Every ambiguity became a divine metaphor. Every failure, a strategic retreat. Every betrayal, a necessary compromise for the greater good. The Gospel of Bolívar was born not as a biography, but as an investment prospectus. The British wanted stability to secure their loans. O'Leary gave them sanctity. The revolution became redemption. The debt became destiny. He smoothed over massacres, censored the correspondence that revealed dependence on London's bankers, and revised Bolívar's last letters to sound prophetic instead of paranoid. By the time the Memorias del General O'Leary began circulating in Europe, the myth had congealed. Bolívar, the pure liberator; England, the benevolent partner. The narrative worked. Latin America's new republics borrowed again. Railways, mines, telegraph lines, each debt underwritten by the same institutions that had once armed their independence. O'Leary became a quiet legend himself, the faithful chronicler, the loyal aide. Few suspected that his true employer had never worn a uniform. One night, before his death, he wrote a final note in the margin of Bolívar's lost will. History is a market like any other. The first to publish sets the price. He sealed it in a tin box, to be opened only when the continent was free. The irony, of course, was that the box and the freedom were both appraised by the same bank. Let's proceed with the Great Default, London's quiet victory over the liberated continent, detailed in the next chapter of The Banker's Liberator. 13. The Republic as Plantation, Post-Independence Economies Rebuilt on Credit and Wage Bondage. Freedom came with ledgers. The flags had changed, but the books remained. Across the new republics, from Caracas to Bogotá, from Quito to Lima, the same patterns reappeared like a watermark beneath fresh paper. The estates stayed in the same hands, the crops moved along the same routes, and the profits sailed to the same ports. Only the signatures at the bottom of the contracts were different. In the plazas, orators spoke of liberty. In the counting houses, clerks entered the first foreign loans into the national debt registers. Independence had been mortgaged in advance. The republics inherited the plantation's logic even as they tore down its fences. Slavery was abolished on paper, but the new citizens were bound by subtler chains. Taxes levied to pay foreign creditors, wages fixed below subsistence, land ownership restricted by titles that only the literate could claim. The plantation had dissolved into a national economy, its overseers now called ministers. Peons replaced slaves, bonds replaced chains, and development replaced extraction. Every imported cannon and uniform, every iron rail and printing press came at the cost of a promise to repay London in gold that would never again be mined on their own soil. The Bank of England called it modernization. In Caracas, they called it destiny. By the 1830s, British merchants dictated tariff policies from drawing rooms in Mayfair. Steamships bearing the new Republican flags were financed, insured, and ultimately owned by London syndicates. The republics became what the empire could no longer afford to hold directly, autonomous colonies of debt. O'Leary's gospel had done its work. Bolívar's name, embalmed in marble, provided the illusion of independence, the perfect moral collateral for the next century's loans. And yet, in the cantinas and fields, a rumor persisted that the Liberator had not died, that he had fled with his fortune to Cuba or Gibraltar or the Yucatan. Some swore they saw him among the dockworkers, unshaven, unrepentant, muttering that freedom could never be borrowed, it had to be stolen. But the bankers preferred ghosts. Ghosts do not default. We continue with the golden fetters. How Bolívar's myth became a bond market. 14. The banker's ghost. London celebrates a free America whose currencies it now owns. The toast was held in a hall lined with mirrors. How fitting. Reflections of wealth applauding reflections of freedom. In the flicker of gaslight, London's merchants raised their crystal glasses to our brave South American cousins, their voices bright with triumph disguised as benevolence. The year was 1835. Bolívar was 3 years dead, or so the pamphlets claimed. In Threadneedle Street, the Bank of England had quietly completed the final stage of the revolution, converting the chaos of war into the order of debt. Each liberated republic now had its own flag, its own anthem, and its own central bank, each one, in practice, pegged to sterling. Their new currencies were baptized in London's financial press: the Bolívar, the peso, the sol. The irony, when unspoken, the Liberator's name had become a unit of exchange. From the city's tall windows, Latin America looked less like a continent than a portfolio. Wheat, copper, silver, cacao, all indexed, insured, and securitized. The Royal Navy no longer needed to enforce dominion. The invisible flotilla of credit did it more efficiently. Behind closed doors, O'Leary's edited papers circulated among the financiers. His Memoirs of the Liberator had proven useful, a patriotic varnish for the brutal arithmetic of lending. The myth of Bolívar provided moral cover for what the ledgers recorded as compound interest. In Caracas, merchants paid their foreign debts before they paid their workers. In Bogotá, the treasury borrowed to build statues of the man whose revolutions had beggared them. A century's worth of future harvests was already pledged to London's banks. The colonies had vanished, but colonial accounting endured. The London papers declared it a new age of global liberty. The Times printed an editorial titled "The Prosperity of the Southern Republics," praising their sound fiscal discipline and commitment to civilization. Between the lines, a quieter truth gleamed. The continent was free precisely because it could no longer afford to rebel. One night, a clerk locking the doors of the Barings Bank claimed to hear laughter in the vaults, soft, derisive, and foreign. He swore it was Bolívar himself, mocking his own immortality. "They freed me," the voice said, "so that my ghost could sign the bonds." By dawn, the exchange rates had shifted again. Sterling rose. Now we move to the forensic resurrection of Bolívar and the proof of substitution, closing the banker's Liberator on the present-day investigation that began this thread. 15. The bones and the broadcast. 2 centuries later, the exhumed skeleton and its televised resurrection. In the summer of 2010, the cameras returned to Bolívar. Not the man, but what was left of him. Under the cold fluorescence of the presidential palace in Caracas, forensic teams in white suits leaned over a coffin draped in the tricolor flag. Millions watched as the lid was unscrewed. The president called it an act of justice, of truth. Outside, fireworks exploded over the city. Inside, the feed trembled, part ritual, part autopsy, part reality show. The face of the Liberator, reconstructed from a skull, flickered into being on national television. Simón Bolívar reborn in 3D, the headlines said. But the bones were restless. The scientists spoke of isotopic markers, of anomalies in bone density and foreign trace elements inconsistent with 19th century Venezuelan soil. The teeth, one whispered, belonged to a man of different age. The DNA comparisons were inconclusive. The official broadcast cut away before that part aired. The myth required continuity, not evidence. Bolívar's body had become the Republic's relic, its authenticity irrelevant so long as it glowed with symbolic power. Yet among the technicians and archivists, a question spread like static. Whose skeleton had they exhumed? Some murmured about O'Leary's final shipment of personal effects to London in 1831. Others noted that the skull's cranial sutures matched those of a Northern European. No one dared say the word substitute aloud. The forensic report was sealed. The president declared the remains verified beyond doubt. The digital face of Bolívar, rendered by state software and broadcast to every household, became the new icon, a messiah of sovereignty whose true body might have lain beneath another flag entirely. "The Liberator lives," the announcer said, "and he smiles upon our revolution." In the control room, a sound engineer caught something faint in the static, an echo between two channels. A man's voice, speaking in English with an Irish lilt. "History is a market like any other." Then silence. Outside, the fireworks faded. And in the vaults of the central bank, freshly printed Bolívars rolled off the presses, each note bearing the face of the man whose ghost had once signed their debt. In the epilogue, the mausoleum ledger, the final reconciliation between myth, market, and remains to close the banker's Liberator with a reflection that loops from the corpse to the currency. Epilogue. The freedom account from shackles to signatures, from empire to market. The Liberator becomes the first modern debtor, and the continent his collateral. In the end, it was not the musket that freed the world, but the pen, and every signature was a new form of surrender. Simón Bolívar had dreamed of a united continent, a vast republic of equals stretching from the Andes to the Atlantic. What he built instead, what the world built through him, was the prototype of a new kind of empire, one without chains, borders, or uniforms. Its walls were made of contracts. Its cannons fired interest rates. Its capital lay not in Madrid, nor London, nor Washington, but in the numbers glowing on the global ledger. He had died believing himself betrayed by men. In truth, he had been betrayed by systems, those invisible empires of credit and trade that no sword could cut through. His revolutions became blueprints for financial independence that would always depend on foreign credit. His portrait, once a rallying cry, became a watermark for a currency printed by the same machine that valued his bones by weight. 2 centuries later, the continents are still paying. Not in blood this time, but in compound interest, on debts denominated in the name of freedom. The plantations have become banks, the overseers wear suits. And Bolívar, embalmed in every transaction, stares from his engraved likeness on paper money that buys less every year. Historians still debate whether the skeleton exhumed in Caracas truly belonged to him. But the deeper question, the one that cannot be televised, is whether Bolívar ever existed at all in the form we were sold. Was he a man, a myth, or merely the first great collateralized hero of modern history? Somewhere, in the ghost archive of the City of London, a forgotten account remains open. Account name: the Freedom Fund debtor, Gran Colombia, defunct, creditor, the Bank of England, eternal, balance, outstanding. At the bottom of the page, in faint sepia ink, a single annotation appears beside the signature of Daniel Florence O'Leary. All revolutions are refinanced eventually. And beside it, another hand, Bolívar's or a forgery, impossible to tell, adds one last line, as if he knew how the century would end. To free a people, one must first free the truth. The entry is dated, but the account has never been closed. The balance of liberty, like the bones of its prophet, remains unsettled. This book was never meant to be written, which is precisely why it had to be. When the official historians run out of ink, pirates take the pen. What you hold in your hands is not a biography, but an exhumation. a digging through ledgers, bones, and broadcast lies to uncover the one truth empire always buries: that freedom is the most expensive product ever sold. They will call this heresy. They will say Bolívar was a saint, a genius, a hero of the people. Perhaps he was. But heroes, like currencies, are minted for circulation, and sooner or later, devalued by those who print their myth. In these pages, the Liberator is stripped of marble and metals. He becomes what the archives suggest he was all along: a debtor in a gilded cage, a client of the City of London, a colonial subject reprogrammed to export revolution on credit. His wars were financed like railroads, his victory collateralized. The republics that rose from his struggle were plantations reborn as markets, their liberty traded in for liquidity. Every empire eventually discovers that conquest costs too much blood, so it invents debt. And debt, obedient and tireless, colonizes where soldiers cannot. That is why this book will be banned, not for its blasphemy against Bolívar, but for its accuracy against finance. It reveals the transition no university dares to teach, from shackles to signatures, from masters to managers, from empire to market. If you read this note before they seize the copies, make your own. Print it, translate it, smuggle it across borders the way gold once moved. Hidden, encrypted, inevitable. The Freedom account remains open. And somewhere, deep in the vaults of history, the interest is still compounding. Pirate first recovered from the banned edition of the Banker's Liberator, flagged for deletion by the Inter-American Historical Trust, London, 2031. Substack note: Pirate first title, The Banker's Liberator, the debt that called itself freedom. 2 centuries after his bones were dug up for the cameras, Bolívar still owes the world an explanation. Not for what he fought, but for who financed the fight. Behind every cry of liberty was a ledger. Behind every revolution, a banker counting bayonets as assets. And behind the marble hero they sold us, a man broken by Parisian debts, refitted by London credit, and embalmed in interest. The republics that rose in his name were plantations reborn as portfolios. The chains became contracts. The whip, an exchange rate. Freedom, our first and most seductive loan. They called him the Liberator. History may yet remember him as the world's first collateralized saint. Hashtag Pirate First, hashtag Bolivar, hashtag Forbidden History, hashtag Debt is Empire, hashtag Financial Colonialism, hashtag The Banker's Liberator, hashtag History is Ledger, hashtag Post-Empire Chronicles, hashtag Parada Primero.
The techno-nomads who arbitrated the fall of nations.
Raise the black. And so we did, and so we never lowered it again. Patience and quiet venom, smart and slow. Under static, kicker spreads, code drips below. No peace in the silence, just a warning. Raw heartbeat sinks with the siren of new war. Bitterness spikes and I sip on the glitch. Digital venom, pixels twitch. I draw my plans into smoke and zeros tonight. Pirates fracture all the heroes.
Another hero falls, another broken scene. They promised truth, they promised light, but all I got was another sleepless night. Trying to fight for solidarity, we're stronger together.
They say I'm going too far, but I'm just who I are. Breaking through the firewall, watch the systems fall. You will never be a billionaire, you stupid fuck. The game is rigged, it's time to say enough. Will we take the wheel? Will they save us all? We'll play the flow, the clock's ticking fast. Where do we go? Knowledge, power, the future seed belongs to us all, not the lords of greed. Claim it now like the anthem ring. Save your ability to sign this thing. But every corrupt system falls. Control, I'll delete the...
The circus survives on reaction. It feeds on outrage, applause, ridicule, belief. It does not care what you think, only that you respond.
The audio booklet, The Afterlife Protocol by Pirate First.
Libertad. 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 Behold the secret of the bankers.
The Art of Peace, Tactics for the Unarmed and Unrolled. A field manual for those who weaponize stillness and decode conflict into clarity. Peace isn't surrender, it's system mastery. In an age where every algorithm trains us to react, peace becomes the final rebellion. This isn't a pacifist pamphlet, it's a field manual for the lucid, the unrolled, and the still awake. The Art of Peace reinterprets strategy as serenity, resistance as rhythm, and silence as a form of intelligence. Printed in black and white like an ancient signal, it's meant to be passed hand to hand, from one calm revolutionary to another. We make peace with the same precision they make war. Pirate first. Share. Here's a poetic and philosophical table of contents for the Art of Peace, structured as a mirror to the art of war, yet derived from its bones, rewritten for a civilization learning to wield harmony with the same precision as conflict.
This is awakening. Change begins now.